I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the history of matrix software. Uh, and if I don't do it, I don't know who else will. My interest in astrology and all things esoteric probably grew out of my Catholic upbringing, a religion which, aside from having for me a lot of negatives, also had the happy side effect of endowing me with a sense of mystery and a sense of awe for the universe. Now, don't ask me to explain how that happened. That's just how it turned out. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, I was interested not only in astrology, but also in tarot, the I Ching, out-of-body states, consciousness in general, and meta-consciousness, and just the whole world of occult or hidden knowledge. It might help you to know that as a high school student, I loved the writing of Dostoevsky so much that I even took Russian in school. And I read everything that author wrote, all 52 works, but I read them in English. My Russian was not that good. However, it was the year that I spent in Berkeley, California, 1964, that kind of cemented the deal for me. In Berkeley, I was exposed to Uspensky, Gurdjieff, all kinds of things, not the least of which was my first LSD trip, which really opened my eyes to the subtle energies and to the unseen. In particular, I realized for the first time that much of what I saw in the outside world was my own projection, and that realization changed my life like forever. Now, I should say something about, I'm not suggesting you run out and take acid. I think it's, I know that it still exists, but I think that it was instrumental in a time of change back in the 60s. And when they say that LSD can permanently alter your mind so that you never return to normal, well, that scared the bejesus out of those of us who were thinking of actually taking it back then. Perhaps they didn't know, or they neglected to say that the permanent change they referred to was, not chemical, not physical, but rather psychological. Acid brought me my first actual realization, just exactly the kind of realizations you have practicing and studying Buddhism. And realizations change how we see things. And that change, a realization, is permanent. That's the kind of permanent that LSD engendered. Once you realize something, you can't go back to an unrealized state. And that's a good thing, because realization is the truth. You realize something you never realized before. And that, in fact, was the kind of permanent change that LSD was capable of, for me at least, back then. Now, after my year at Berkeley, when I moved back to Ann Arbor in 1965, everything seemed to come to a head. I won't go into all that period here in detail, because it's mostly musical, but from the summer of 1965 on through the early 70s, I did little else but study black music, the blues in particular, and I played in a blues band called the Prime Movers Blues Band. Now that's a whole nother story, and I want to stick with astrology here. Talk a bit about circle books. In 1968, right on the spring equinox, my younger brother Stephen, his wife Morgan, and his partner and friend John Crowfoot Sullivan opened Circle Books. It was the first metaphysical bookstore in Ann Arbor. It was located at 215 South State, up on the second floor, just at the top of the stairs. In fact, if you went up those stairs and kept on walking, you were there. Circle Books consisted of two medium-sized rooms and a back room which was an office. I was proud of my brother Stephen, who was an astrologer, for bringing to Ann Arbor something the town never had but really needed. Prior to Circle Books, the only place to get anything close to metaphysical books was Bob Marshall's, and that bookstore was already in trouble with publishers, and it closed not long after Circle Books opened. The other bookstore in this university town, Ann Arbor, were all about textbooks for college courses, and they offered little else. Circle Books became a gathering place for those of us with an interest in alternative spirituality. Circle Books was in a building, perhaps the only one in Ann Arbor, that was devoted to 60s themes. Like on the floor above the bookstore, the third floor, was a shop called Middle Earth, which was a glorified Gone to Heaven head shop. On the same floor as the bookstore was Saturn, a 60s style mod clothing store. And in the basement was a shop called Little Things, filled with all kinds of neat little things. And on the main floor was a chic, expensive clothing store. The whole building was probably a bit of a trip for some visitors back in the middle 60s. Now, in the beginning, Circle Books looked pretty empty. Some simple pre-made bookshelves placed against the wall, and not quite enough yet books. I'm not sure how I got involved, but I did. After all, I was Stephen's older brother, and also interested in astrology. I mean, that would do it right there. As I say, I had a growing interest in astrology and beyond, all things metaphysical. And Stephen was already an astrologer, as well as I was too, but he was one before I was. I was many things. At the time, I believe I encouraged or helped enthuse John Sullivan to invest more money in the store to modify it, and he did. Within weeks of opening, I found myself hard at work helping them to remodel the store so that it had a more new age and sophisticated look. I ended up designing and supervising, I believe, the rebuilding of the entire store in redwood and glass. Back then, redwood was just another beautiful, of course, wood at the lumber yard. In fact, it was cheaper than clear pine. Imagine that. When we were done, the entire bookstore was finished in redwood with frosted globe lights and backlit frosted glass panels at the top of the shelves, and the shelves were boxed in all the way down to the floor. It really was beautiful. Better yet, we had two really great aquariums, one for freshwater fish and a really big one for saltwater. This was mostly John Sullivan's interest, and I loved it. It was really beautiful. And finally, we had a 4-foot chart wheel, astrology chart wheel, also backlit, that displayed the current astrology of the day. The whole thing was just beautiful. Now, John Sullivan and Stephen and Morgan ran the bookstore. But I ended up calculating the astrology charts for the store, at first by hand, using the traditional log table approach, pencil, paper, and later in the early 70s, I was able to use a little 4-function calculator. And I probably helped out with sales at times, and I know I occasionally gave classes in the large second room some evenings. But mostly I just hung out there a lot. Circle Books was just the perfect place to spend time, place to meet new people and to have lengthy intellectual conversations on astrology, the occult, and just all things spiritual, especially alternative spiritual. People came from towns near and far to shop at Circle Books. because until then most of us had no place and no one to talk to about these spiritual matters, these alternative ones. The bookstore was like a conversation waiting to happen. So for me, Circle Books was almost like a dream come true, even otherworldly at times. There were plenty of outside windows in it, and the inner store with its globe lights and backlit panels made the overall effect something special. You just naturally wanted to go there. How many times did I come up those stairs, 2 steps at a time, and step into Circle Books for a wonderful time? The answer is many, many, many. You could probably say that I held court there, and I wasn't the only one. It just naturally happened. Before long, I not only had some students, but many new friends. Ann Arbor had never before catered to those with an interest in spiritual and metaphysical things, and they just flocked to the store. In 1969, my brother Stephen and I published the Circle Books Astrological Calendar, which has been published every year since then. It's still going strong today, 40 some years. Actually, as of now, it's no longer printed, but for 40 some years it was. Because today you can get all kinds of astrological calendars in virtual formats just that you can use on a computer. Anyway, that was quite a run. Now, I eventually left Ann Arbor to run greenhouses in northern Michigan, and then later Margaret and I ran 19,000 square feet of glass greenhouses in Apopka, Florida in late 1971. But that's a whole other story, and one that didn't work out too well. Anyway, when I returned to Ann Arbor after my adventures in the green plant business, early in 1972, I was able to pick up the chart work for the bookstore again, and I also began offering many different evening classes. Stephen and I also started a local astrological group called Ann Arbor Astrological Association, 5 A's. And I even designed a special logo and poster for it. The meetings, I think, were held weekly in the evening at the store. I can't remember what day. And Circle Books survived for something like 6 years. But as the other bookstores in Ann Arbor begin to pick up what are called the bread and butter books, the most popular New Age and astrology titles, it meant less and less sales for Circle Books. And when sales flagged even further, the store was eventually sold in 1974 to Robert Thibodeau from the Detroit area, who had his own metaphysical store in Ferndale called Mayflower Books. And Thibodeau cherry-picked the books he wanted for his store and eventually sold Circle Books to another would-be bookseller not long afterward. But it soon faltered and failed as well. Like all mandalas, it bloomed and then it was gone. Thibodeau, I believe, still has an occult bookshop in Ferndale, Michigan, and remains a good friend. By this time, I had been a professional astrologer already operating out of my home at 1041 North Main Street. I'd been doing it for a couple years. Making a living as an astrologer is no easy task, at least for me. I was working all the time, doing readings, giving classes, writing courses, making flyers, the flyers which I would post all over town. By 1975, I was also operating my own mail-order astrological book business out of my home. And this really was a shoestring operation, and our house was small at that. So maybe I'll talk for a little bit about our house at 1041 North Main Street in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We lived in this little house perched high on an embankment out on 1041 North Main. It overlooked the Huron River, which runs parallel to the street. But the river's on the other side of the street, beyond the junkyard and the train tracks. Our house was out on the edge of town. I mean, right before the highway begins, so we could have heavy traffic at times and often plenty of noise. There was also no kind of road for a kid to be near. I mean, after all, it was even called Main Street. And we were, as mentioned, directly across from Lansky's junkyard, with all that entailed, which meant that giant wharf rats would cross the street and could be seen digging through the garbage cans at the side of our house in the dusk, or the early morning light. These rats were the size of small cats. Also, less than 1/2 block from our house, freight trains ran both east and west and north and south all night long, starting and stopping, turning, creaking and crying. One of the train tracks slowly clanged around a big turn and across the river bridge only yards from where we lived. The sound of steel on steel actually became almost beautiful, like after a while. Sounds like some of the Japanese imperial court music called gagaku, with the free reed oboe-like imperial music, of Japan. I almost miss it. Almost. Behind our house was a very steep hill running straight up to another whole part of Ann Arbor high above us. It was difficult to climb even if you wanted to. The house faced east, so we could watch the sun come up on the river early summer mornings. It was one of those places that few people would want to live, but we loved it. It was almost outside of Ann Arbor and not smack in it, and kind of isolated, yet still near enough to where things were happening. It was a good compromise. The house itself was small, nothing special, but it was special for us because it was where we lived, and the rent was low enough that we could afford to stay there as long as I could find some work. At that time we had next to nothing, and I had few ways to make a living, and I was the provider. I picked up odd jobs as a stagehand, or I mixed clay and helped to fire pottery at a friend's studio. I had lost most of the income streams I'd built up before I left Ann Arbor to go into the green plant business. And when that didn't work out, I found my way back to my hometown, Ann Arbor, but things had changed. I had changed. The house itself was far above the street, as I mentioned, so that by the time you reached the second floor where my office was, you were really up high. Right? You were right in the high branches of trees right outside the window. There was this sense of no one else around, although there were a couple of houses in the same situation to the right and left of us. But there were no houses in front or behind us, only north and south of us along the highway at Main Street. Other than that, there was no one else around. We were maybe a block from where the rest of the town started. It was just down a little sidewalk, through some weeds, and under a bridge over which one of the train tracks ran. That's where you could say you're in Ann Arbor. Anyway, this was where we lived from the spring of 1972 until March 1st of 1980. That's when we relocated to Big Rapids, Michigan, where we live today. But the Main Street house was where Matrix Software was born. Also, where our two kids were born and raised. And it was where so much that has affected astrology began. Great astrologers like Noel Till, Dane Rudger, and many, many others visited us, came to that house by the river and the junkyard. We had next to nothing, but actually we had everything we needed. Like we had time and we had a vision, and that was enough. One major change that came around the end of May of 1972 was that Margaret told me she was pregnant and that we were expecting our first child. I was surprised and happy, but also terrified as to what it meant for our lives. It would no longer be just Margaret and I, we could live on next to nothing. As a natural provider type, the news sent shockwaves through me, and I was really turned around by it. I mean, we were barely surviving as it was. In fact, I was so panicked about providing that the very next day after I heard the news, I went out and got a job on a garbage truck just to prove to myself that I had to be willing to do anything. The job lasted one day, and I came home pretty stinky. And it was fun hanging off the running boards at the back of the garbage truck and having people, I guess, feel sorry for me. Anyway, after I calmed down, I realized that I could probably find some work better than hauling garbage. I did have some abilities, just not a high school diploma. I had never gotten out of high school. In fact, I still have dreams of being back in high school trying to get the diploma that I never got. I've been an entrepreneur all of my working life. Even back then, I had more trouble working for others than for myself. I wanted to fit in, but it was always easier to create my own livelihood than it was to simply blend in somewhere else. I don't blend well. It would have been nice to be able to just go along, but that was just not me. My critical gifts are too strong, and criticism, unless applied just so, is not welcome much of anywhere in this world. We all know that. And I was not always skillful in my criticism. I'm a pretty direct person. Anyway, I was soon searching inside myself to find some kind of living that was more in line with what I naturally liked to do, what I could do. And I had been doing a lot of astrology, so in August of 1972, I decided to become a full-time professional astrologer, and I literally hung out my shingle. I had worked with astrology for many years, helping to build Circle Books with my brother's bookstore, teaching classes there, and doing the chart work for the store. So when I returned to Ann Arbor from my greenhouse jaunt, I picked back up, doing the astrological charts for Circle Books. So it was natural for me to expand my services and to work out of my home, and that's exactly what I did. The problem was that we didn't have much room in our house. It was little. In fact, it was tight. For example, we had one small living room in which was a couch, and that couch would fold out into our bed. So we used to have classes in that living room, and when everyone was gone, and if we were dead tired, we would immediately turn out the light, unfold the couch, and climb in. Well, sometimes the student would have forgotten something or other, and soon after we were in bed, there would be pounding on the door. It was pretty funny to answer the door because directly behind the open door was our open bed. I think Margaret might have been hiding under the covers sometimes, for all I remember. Anyway, that had to change. Our house also had 2 bedrooms on the second floor, and we decided that the larger one of them would become my office and the, quote, classroom. There would be no more classes in the living room. They all would be held upstairs, which left us with only one small room to sleep in, which appropriately became known as the bedroom, because it literally had wall-to-wall beds to sleep the whole family. After our second child was born late in 1975, you could walk across the beds from one side of the room to the other with no gaps. The kids loved it. And I liked having the room, a room upstairs, because someplace that I could hold classes and be kind of more private. Students would file up the stairs and into the classroom, past Margaret, who was trying to bathe and put the kids to bed in the next room, or in the bathroom, which was open to see. The whole thing was close. Of course, I never thought of it as anything but grand. Having a house to live in? Good grief. In my office, I had a desk against the south wall and a large blackboard on the north wall. And I had my IBM Selectric typewriter. I wrote whole books on that typewriter. That and my calculators were about all I had in the way of equipment for many years. This was way before computers. And in the office during the day, I would work and I would do readings, so that there was a constant stream of people who filed in up the stairs, into my office. It was hard on my family to have people coming in and out all day long. Then at night I would cram any number of students into my office, all squished together. My classes were literally up close and personal, and I'm told I was pretty tough on some of my students. It's true. If they were not paying attention, if they mouthed off, I would simply escort them to the door and put them out. I think I did that to Bob Thibodeau one time. They were lucky that I didn't grab them by the ear on the way. So that's the end of that story. Back then, for us, it was hard scrabble all the way, never having any money, and reinventing myself every which way I could think of to come up with new services so that we could pay the rent. So I was speaking at churches and schools and colleges and meetings and about anywhere that they would have me. I taught classes at Circle Books, at Art Worlds, at Guild House, at the YMCA, the Free University, in our own place, which became known as the Heart Center. I once taught an astrology class of 1,200 people in the Michigan Ballroom on the second floor of the Michigan Student Union. You know, it was part of something called the Free University. Margaret and I would also participate in all kinds of New Age psychic conferences and gatherings. I would be there as the astrologer, but most other speakers that came were psychic readers, you know, healers, tarot readers, palmists, and whatnot, all over the board. And along the way, we checked out seances, healings, hands-on healings, message services, and about anything else that was out there. It was all fascinating, at least for a while. We even drove down to Camp Chesterfield, Indiana, which is a community of healers and spiritualists, to have our firstborn daughter, Iotis, baptized. And once there, we went around to the little cottages where the healers lived and visited those that we had met at conferences here and there. Altogether, I tried really hard to be open to it. But none of the psychic or spiritualism managed to stick with me. It was, however, somewhat of an education. One of my favorite psychics was a woman named Elsie Volkovich, who lived right in Ann Arbor, out on the west side. Elsie was a kindly woman, and we would visit her quite often, either to just sit and talk or to be part of whatever service or seance-like event she might be holding that evening. I can remember that during one seance, I was told that my spirit guide was an Indian medicine man named Drum Song. And sometimes on Sundays, we would attend the spiritualist church that Elsie belonged to, and we would check it out. And one of the features there was the giving of messages. Various psychics would come up front and deliver messages for those in the audience. I mean, they would actually single you out and pull messages out of the ether that were specifically for you. Mostly they were upbeat, you know, and certainly always intriguing because they were about me. And of course I would try my best to bend each message around whatever I had going on for me, whatever I wanted to hear. But over time I began to have problems with psychic pronouncements in general. I can remember one such statement having to do with a road in an overpass in Ann Arbor. The psychic told me that I had to be very careful of this particular overpass or I might have an accident. Well, you can be sure that I've never forgotten that overpass. Multiply that by 10 or more such pronouncements and you might have a fairly healthy list of things you had to watch out for. I found this really annoying after a while. I partook in what I call the chiropractor syndrome, meaning that like chiropractors, psychics tend to make you dependent on them. You have to keep coming back again and again and again to have your psychic temperature checked out and your problems patched up. So after some considerable experience, I gradually tuned away from this kind of spirituality. One becomes too dependent on the psychic as a person, and even worse, the psychics seem to like it. So I'm not sure how I rationalize my view of psychic readings. considering that I made my living doing astrology readings for many years. I'm sure the public can't tell the difference, but for me, the difference is that at least the readings I did were one-offs and did not require that you come back for another one. In fact, I discouraged repeat visits. I was not a therapist, and I didn't like doing therapy. Now, of course, astrology is about cycles based on heavenly motions that reoccur rather than specific events that are called up from the ether or whatever. So I can see that this discussion can get murky, so I'm not going to try to rationalize this with myself right here in your presence, but it's on my list of things to think about. Now, in the middle of all this scrambling for money, doing readings, teaching classes, and lecturing, there was something else going on as well. My interest in astrology was deepening, broadening. I had real questions, and I set about finding the answers. After some years, I was able to move from log tables, pencil and paper, to the four-function calculator, and still using pencil and paper, somewhere in the early 70s. That helped. The four-function calculator did not appear for most of us until 1972. Can you believe it? Many of my questions required that I learn something more about trigonometry, and before long I was doing extended series of trig calculations on a lowly pocket calculator. Before that, it was doing them with trig tables. Either way, it took a long time. I can remember calculating early local space charts, azimuth and altitude, that would take me the entire day to do the numbers trigonometrically just for a single chart. I think I'll stop here for now, but the next section would be about matrix software and computers.